Today, we're going to be looking at how we can use ChatGPT to do the heavy lifting when we're working with an API. Now, here we're going to be working with the CraftMyPDF API, and we're using this to do a couple of different things related to PDFs. We're going to create a PDF, we're going to merge a couple of PDFs, and we're also going to watermark the PDFs. What we're going to do is troubleshoot the watermarking part of the request, and I'm going to show you how I use ChatGPT as my sort of coding API assistant to really speed up my workflow. So we could start by just asking ChatGPT for our API documentation. We've got a couple of different options here. We've got our API docs direct with CraftMyPDF, as well as a integration through Rapid API. And I prefer this method to find the API documentation because a lot of the time the documentation can be very hard to find for obscure APIs. Now, that is slightly different to the documentation that I'm referencing here, and that's probably because it's linked to a slightly outdated version. However, if we jump over here, we can see that we've got a REST API documentation as well, and then that will take me over to this reference here. But at least it gets me in the right spot. Now, in terms of our documentation, we're going to be looking at the merge PDF URLs call. Could be any of these calls here, but this one requires us to do some configuration of the data that we're sending to get the right output for our result. Here's the end result that we're trying to achieve, and that's just simply watermarking all the PDF images with a text across the page. Now, that's a fairly simple thing to do with the CraftMyPDF API because they had a very simple API to use. However, we can definitely speed up our process a little bit by communicating with ChatGPT to set this up for us. So here I've added a API connector into Bubble, which is what I'm using here for doing the API call. You could use the HTTP module inside of Make as well, or you could also use the API call within the CraftMyPDF module here, and then you can do a custom call, making sure that when you do the custom call, you're making the path, the URL, relative to this URL here, which means that you need to essentially just put the /v and then the endpoint that you're calling. So if we look at our data here, the endpoint that I'm calling here is add watermark. And here in the API request, I would put this here as my URL. Next, I need to do a post, and then I'm going to post the body. And CraftMyPDF make this rather easy. They just give me a sample body that I can copy. And I love it when an API does that because it just makes my job a lot easier. You can see here when I paste that in, it just gives me a very clunky sort of text. So I'm going to format that a little bit, and I'll just ask ChatGPT to format that for me. So there it goes. It's going to format the JSON. It will also check the JSON for any errors in the code when it does that. And then I can paste that back in. And now we've got something that's a lot easier for us to work with. Here I've got the URL of the file. I'm just going to map that from the Google Drive here. Importantly, with Google and most cloud storage systems, you'll have to make sure that you have the link that you're putting in here as a public link. Otherwise, the CraftMyPDF will not be able to access that file. Here we've got the text that we're going to write on the PDF. Now I'm just going to put test in here. The font size, opacity, rotations, color, family, all of those things, we're just going to get ChatGPT to recommend those settings for us. And then I already know I can drop this off of the end here because I read the API documentation here, and we're not doing this post action, so I can just get rid of that. And then we're just defaulting to the cloud storage option. So I'm going to paste this back into ChatGPT, and I'm just going to put in a very basic prompt here. And I'm also going to give it the options for the font family. And that way it will just pick the best font family for me. So you can see it's given us some recommendations here using a gray, using Helvetica Bold, and setting opacity. Now that's slightly different to the default values that CraftMyPDF recommended. And you can see it's adjusted some things here. So we'll just copy that back and we'll put that into our call here. I'm going to get a URL to test with. And so I've just replaced the Google Drive file URL with just a PDF URL, just so I can do some testing. And now I can check my result. And you can see we've got the test word here in gray. That's probably good enough as is. You can see it's a little bit larger than what the original default was, but I could also put this back into ChatGPT. I can take a screenshot of this. So I can just upload the screenshot and put in a very simple prompt, and then we can see what it's going to adjust in the input, if anything. It says that the size is probably a little bit too small, given the image that we showed. 45 is fine. It's happy with the font. However, it does think that the hex color probably needs to change as well. So now we can just copy our new input. And then once we pasted that, we can then rerun, get the link, and then compare our original one with the new one. So you can see it's just made it a little bit larger and made the font color a little bit darker as well. So here I'm communicating with ChatGPT to just refine the watermark a little bit further. I know that I'm not going to use an actual word. And so because I'm not using a word, I'm going to use a code. The code needs to be a little bit clearer because when a human is reading it, it's not going to be easy to see. So I'm just going to take the recommendations, and now you can see that it's very clear on the page compared to the previous one. It may be possibly a little bit too clear, and I may want to just dial it back slightly, but I would say that's pretty good on the page. And by using ChatGPT, I was able to not have to think whilst I'm setting this up. I can just put in the problems and issues that I'm finding, put in some screenshots as I troubleshoot this API, and ChatGPT can then think for me. And it can then find the color, it can think about size, the font. And when I look at that font list, I have no idea what all those different fonts are or how they look. So I would have to go to Google and have a look. What does this one look like? What does that one look like? And it just takes a lot of time. ChatGPT, on the other hand, already knows what all those fonts look like, and it can then very quickly recommend the right font for our use case. Particularly if we give it some background. Like here, we've given it more background. It's not just a watermark like private or confidential, it's a code. And so a code is much harder to read unless we make it much clearer on the page. You can imagine if we put a code here, or even in the first one, it would be quite hard to read that gray code because it's not an actual word. Whereas on the last output, we've got a very clear code, different color, and you can very clearly see what that code says. So that's how I use ChatGPT in troubleshooting APIs and really in my everyday work. I use it as a coding assistant and a developer assistant. Whenever I've got a question, whenever I want to put custom code into an app or fix something that I'm having a problem with, I just literally copy the errors and screenshot things, paste it into ChatGPT, and then I ask it for a solution. And it is very good at doing that. It takes a lot of the mental work away from my job, and I just have to do the implementation.